Hello AP Psychology students, and welcome to our next unit. Today we are starting our unit on social psychology, and social psychology has a bunch of different topics within it. We're going to talk about the way that we perceive others, the way that situations impact us. We're going to talk about our attitudes and our judgments and prejudice, discrimination, conformity, obedience, so a bunch of topics that relate basically to how the group, right, and the situation impact our behavior. So we're starting with topic 4.1, which is attribution theory and person perception. So in order to address this topic, there's a few objectives we're going to go over. So we're going to explain how attribution theory, how a locus of control, and how person perception impact our behavior and mental processes. And we're going to do this through two essential questions. So the first essential question is, what influences how we form impressions or judgments of others and ourselves? And then the second one is, what biases are our impressions vulnerable to? So when we talk about person perception and attribution theory, the first thing we want to focus on is just the definition of person perception. Like, what does that even mean? So person perception is how we form impressions of ourselves or others. How we explain to ourselves when something happens, why people did what they did, right? Why do they do what they do? Why do we do what we do? Are people good? Are they bad? Are we good or bad, right? So how do we explain in our minds to ourselves, right, that little, like, always kind of tape running inside our brain? How does it work in making decisions about those around us? So we find that there's a couple of factors that tend to influence these impressions. They are attribution theory, beliefs about your control, social comparison, and exposure. So first, attribution theory. So attribution theory is a fancy kind of explanation for something very simple, right? It's when something happens, do you blame the situation or do you blame the personality of the person or yourself, right? And things are happening all around us all the time, so we're constantly doing this. So, very quick, simplistic example, you are walking in the hallway to class and someone bumps into you. So you could either blame their behavior, they're rude, they're careless, etc., disposition. So that would be a dispositional attribution because you are blaming their personality. Or you could think like, I wonder if they're distracted or they didn't see me, or like, I wonder if they have to travel really far to their next class, or I wonder if their teacher's really strict on tardies, or any of those things. And that would be a situational attribution because you are thinking about and kind of blaming, quote unquote, or explaining the behavior based on the situation that they are in. Now, in addition to this, we tend to have very characteristic ways that we explain things. So this is called an explanatory style, and there's two basic options, pessimistic and optimistic. So if your explanatory style is pessimistic, you tend to view things through a negative lens, and if it's optimistic, a more positive lens. And then this can, of course, your view of it can change the way that you explain it. So for example, let's say something bad happens. If you're an optimist, you tend to think it's temporary, or you kind of focus on the challenge of it. You kind of look for another outward cause that you might, change in the future. However, if you're pessimistic, you think, oh my gosh, I'm a failure, everything bad always happens to me, this is all my fault, etc. Now, we are open or likely to commit some biases when we form attribution. So when we decide if it's the situation or the personality, we are subject to bias. So one of the biases that we're subject to is this actor-observer bias. And this is really just saying that when you're the actor in the situation, you focus more on the role of the environment. But when you're the observer, you tend to focus more on the personality, right? So what does this look like in our hallway situation? So if you are the person who bumped into someone in the hallway, if you're the actor, it's likely that in your mind, you would explain what happened as, I was distracted, I didn't see them, I have to go such a far way, my next hour teacher is very strict on tardies, right? So you would give yourself an external attribution. However, if you saw someone bump into someone else in the hallway, you were the observer, it's likely that you would explain their behavior as dispositional. So you would say they were rude or careless, or they don't care about people, or etc. Now, this makes sense because you don't know that person's situation and you do know your own, right? But it's important to remember that just because you don't know their situation doesn't mean they don't have one, right? So I thought this cute little cartoon about Starbucks drink orders was relevant to this actor observer bias. When someone else orders a really complicated drink, they're pretentious, they're annoying, whatever. But when you order a really, kind of complicated drink, it's because you are a coffee lover or because you have special dietary needs or, right? The situation is different. Another bias that we're very vulnerable to is fundamental attribution error. So this is similar to action observer bias. So if you feel like there's a lot of overlap, you're not wrong. But it's more specific in that fundamental attribution error only applies to others. So the idea here is that when somebody behaves a certain way, you overestimate their personality and underestimate the situation, right? And what does this look like? So a student is late to class almost every day, right? And you're another student in this class and the student comes in late every day. So you're more likely to overestimate that they don't care about school, that they're unmotivated, any of those kind of like personality factors. You overestimate that and you ignore maybe some situational influences, right? Maybe they have to drop a sibling off, maybe they're having car trouble, any number of things, right? So fundamental attribution error is when you overestimate character, personality, and underestimate situation. Another bias that we are vulnerable to is self-serving bias. So this is when people take credit for their success and blame external factors for their failure or mistakes. So if you get an A on a test, you're so smart, you studied so hard, but if you get an F, the test was unfair, my teacher doesn't teach me, blah, 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 right? So the question is, why do we care about this, right? What is the impact of this? So your explanation as situational or dispositional will impact your reaction, which then will impact the relationship with that person. So let's say that this is a boss or a teacher and Laura, this person, is late. So if they take a situational attribution, they might think, oh my gosh, there's a traffic jam, their daughter is sick, they're in trouble, and they have a more open, kind of kind, understanding conversation when the person gets there. They're assuming positive intent, right? And then that's more likely to breed a positive relationship. Whereas if you assume that it's their personality, they're unreliable, they are unmotivated, or any number of negative personality traits that are causing them to be late, then you're more likely to have a negative conversation, which could lead to a more negative or toxic relationship. Okay, so the next thing that impacts our person perception is locus of control. So this is the idea of how much, your belief about how much control you have over your life. So if you're an internal, you think you have a lot of control. And if you're an external, you think fate or luck is in control. And this matters because if you perceive others, so if you think you have a lot of control over your life, if you're an internal, you are likely to think that about others, which is fine. However, it might be true sometimes that you give people more responsibility than they really have. Like, for example, if you feel an internal locus for your failures, you might blame others for their failures, but sometimes their failures might be outside of their control, right? And we're not really aware of it. And the same thing for external too. So if you're an external, you might see others as external and not give them credit for their success. So it can impact the way you understand things. So social comparison is another way that we perceive people, or a factor that impacts our perceptions. So this is just the way that you evaluate yourself by comparing to others. You can compare yourself upward, so someone you perceive as better, or downward, someone you perceive as worse. And that impact of that social comparison can lead to something called relative deprivation, which is where we compare what we have to others, and we feel deprived if we have less than them, right? We're always judging ourselves based on others, and if we have less than what they have, we feel deprived. Even if we have a lot, even if we have everything we need, we still feel deprived, right? So, you get a new iPhone and you feel like, okay, great, and then 6 months later your friend gets the newest iPhone, and now you feel deprived because you don't have the newest iPhone and they have the new iPhone, right? And last factor that influences our perception of people is the mere exposure effect. So this is the idea that our perception of how much we like something or someone can be influenced by how often we see it, right? So if we take a look at this, the idea is that the more often you see something, the more you like it. And this can really impact our perception of others because people tend to have dislike for things that they're unfamiliar. You may have a negative opinion of people or ideas that you're not exposed to. But we find that if we can expose people to these ideas, to people who they haven't been exposed to. So let's say, for example, you grew up in the part of the country where you only had exposure to a certain, race of people. So let's say you were surrounded by only white people, or only black people, or only Asian people. Well, then you might have a negative or, cautious opinion of someone who is not like that because you don't have exposure to them. So what we find is that if we can expose you to a different population of people over time, that will actually breed liking and breed familiarness, and then that can change your feelings, right? So we can use this effect to increase our ability to kind of like understand someone else's perspective and viewpoint and make us have a more positive opinion of other people. So remember to stop here and make sure you can answer these 2 essential questions. Today we talked about all the factors that influence our perception of others: attribution, locus of control, comparison, and mere exposure effect. That's all for now, AP Psychos, and remember, psychology is flippin' awesome.